Hi, everybody, and welcome to Basic Black. You know, some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Crystal Haynes, your host for tonight. Callie Crossley is off. And tonight, we're talking about William Monroe Trotter, his legacy, and the influence on social justice. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We're working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Boston Guardian newspaper co-founder and editor William Monroe Trotter was an outspoken advocate for racial equity and support of African Americans. One of the architects of the Niagara movement, which later became the NAACP, his activism was contentious and at times at odds with other black leaders like W.E.B Dubois. His rigorous debate extended to the White House, challenging President Woodrow Wilson on segregation in federal offices. As we recognize Mr. Trotter's legacy, we reflect on his impact on social justice and civil rights today for a new generation. Joining us remotely is Reverend Cornell William Brooks, professor and director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at Harvard Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. Dr. Paula Austin is the assistant professor of history and African American studies at Boston University. Deborah Douglas is co-editor-in-chief of the Emancipator. And Lalou Trotter Dammond who is a director and a producer, and she is currently making a documentary about William Monroe Trotter, who is her great-great-uncle. Thank you so much, and welcome to you all for joining us. So, Reverend Brooks, I want to start with you. What does activism look like today, in your opinion, and what can we learn from William Monroe Trotter's fight for equal rights for African Americans?
Sure. Activism today is really at an unprecedented level. So when people think about and talk about the 1960s as in the golden era, right, with a nostalgic tone in their voices, they need to contemplate the fact that in the wake of George Floyd's death, we saw 26 million Americans across 550 jurisdictions take to the streets. We have not seen this level of activism in literally a generation. So with that being said, the activism is widespread, it's digitally inspired. But if we look back 100 years ago, look back at the time of Trotter, and we think about the ferocity of his activism. We think about the fact that his activism took place in the context of voting rights, opposition to segregation, opposition to peonage or debt, slavery, opposition to lynching. That comports with what we see today, namely opposition to voter suppression, opposition to the modern day lynching, that is to say police brutality and police homicide. And so what I'm saying to you is that activism of today in many ways mirrors what we saw during Trotter's time and under Trotter's leadership. And in terms of lessons, I would say a few. Number one, thinking about the ferocity, the intensity of his activism. Number two, the fact that there was an intellectual basis for it. This was an incredibly brilliant man. The first Black Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Harvard. There was an uncompromising quality to his activism. So in other words, Du Bois said of his newspaper that it was bitter, personal, satirical, that not everyone agreed with it, but everyone read it. The point being, he was Black Twitter before there was Twitter. And so in this moment, if we think about activism, I think we need to think about it in the way that I think that he did, which is to say it occurs in many sectors, that you take the fight to the people, right? In other words, you have people involved, ordinary people involved, that you engage and educate people of all different classes, all different backgrounds. And then last point here is a deep integrity, right? The fact that he gave his life to the cause of his people in ways that did not result in remuneration. He didn't get rich. He wasn't looking for followers. He wasn't looking for clout. He was looking to serve his people. And that is an inspiration in this moment.
Well, Dr. Austin, I want to ask you, how important is it to continue teaching about Trotter's philosophy and social activism?
Incredibly important. I think, you know, a lot of my students show up and they haven't heard of him before, even students who are from Boston don't actually know who he was. They don't know about The Guardian. And these are students who are really steeped in understanding the important role of media, specifically social media, in our contemporary movement. And so Trotter is this great person to talk about the important role of media early in the 20th century, in the late 19th century, as we get, growing Black institutions and Black intellectual leadership in the New Negro movement of the early 20th century, late 19th century. So, and I think the other piece of why it's important to know about Trotter's role in the New Negro movement against all of the things that Reverend Brooks just laid out, anti-lynching, against voter suppression, suffrage, race and representation in media. So the protest against Birth of a Nation, for example, it's important to understand Trotter's role, radical role in that movement, because it helps us look at our contemporary movement. When we look at the debates, the disagreements between movement leaders or between organizations, between activists about how to approach a particular goal, what are the strategies? And I think we get such an incredible example in the early New Negro movement about the possibilities of those debates and the necessity of multiple strategies, right? Some of which we might call radical, and others that maybe seem more conservative or sort of liberal at their heart. But we actually need the diversity of strategies and the diversity of ideologies and approaches to make any movement successful. So it's important to look at Trotter's ideologies, his strategies, his approaches, as well as Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, for example. I think we need all of it. And I think the last thing I'll say is just the messiness, I think, of that is so important for us to see historically and for us to help us look at the contemporary movement.
Absolutely. Lalou, I want to ask you, I know that you're putting together this film and you obviously have these family ties, right? And stories that are probably passed down through the generations. What kind of similarities or differences do you see in the way that young activists are practicing, acquiring their civil rights or affirming their civil rights to, your great-great-uncle's work and his techniques there?
That's a good question. And, I'd like to echo a little bit of what Paula was saying, which is that, and it's funny because it's a little contradictory to Monroe Trotter's way, which is that we do need a diversity of voices in the movement. And Trotter, on the other hand, was a little bit, he was very against Booker T. Washington's accommodationist, or, there are many ways to describe what Booker T. Washington was confronting, whereas Trotter really was dismissive of that. He felt that the radical way was the only way that Black people had to seize their rights and couldn't wait for white people or other to ensure their civil rights. And I think today, we have those voices that are radical, of course, and then we have the spectrum. And I think that maybe there will be people on the radical end who think the more moderate route is a waste of time. But, I think from my perspective, I think we do need all voices and we need to work, hopefully together from all prongs at work to gain momentum and progress.
And Deborah, bringing you in here, when we're talking about journalism and other media types, where do you see Trotter's legacy in that, and where do you see the development of journalism since?
Absolutely. Well, as for the Emancipator, where I'm the co-editor-in-chief, we are taking a page directly from the Trotter Handbook in terms of being uncompromising in our reimagining of what journalism can do and be for the public, not just for Black audiences, but for a larger audience that especially was convicted by the events of 2020, the police murder of George Floyd, the revelation for some people of the disparate impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. And so when I go back and I engage with the Trotter story, and I see how he was a trailblazer for direct action, which was a model for the mid-century civil rights movement. And then you see how that impacts the Black Lives Matter movement today, and how that has created this hunger for deeper context and a historical through line that could be pulled through to today to help us make better decisions. We take that charge very seriously.
Absolutely. And Reverend Brooks, I know that there was an anniversary celebration, 150 years of William Monroe Trotter at the Collaboratives Conference. Talk to me a little bit about that. What were some of the highlights there?
Sure. So first of all, I'm so thankful that both Deborah and Lalou are here, because they were so key and so important to that event. So 150 years after the birth of William Monroe Trotter, Harvard University was called to recognize his radical legacy on its campus. And so that involved inviting students from the William Monroe Trotter Elementary School who came to campus with the Trotter family, and in the courtyard lifted up his legacy in front of a birthday cake, perhaps 150 years too late, in terms of Harvard recognizing Trotter's legacy. And then on the first day, we were blessed to have the Trotter family talk about his legacy in the context of their family story. We had Keisha Blaine, who's the author of the wonderful biography on Fannie Lou Hamer, give a lecture with the president of Harvard and the dean of the Kennedy School about the Trotter legacy. And then the second day, the second day was about not 150 years ago, or even the intervening century and a half, but 2022. We had young activists and academics and advocates all on the same platform talking about what we can do today in terms of reparations, what we can do today in terms of voting rights, what we can do today in terms of climate change. And so we discussed both the policy what, that is to say, what are these issues? What's the policy content, the law, and public policy, but also what can we do and how do we do it? How do we raise money for social justice activism? How do we engage with the press? How do we get our message out? And how do we do direct action and that kind of thing? So it was incredibly, incredibly exciting. And I love to believe that the Trotter would be proud of what we tried to do in his name.
And Lalou, I want to ask you, Trotter was a family member there. How did his legacy impact maybe the family stories, what you went into, things like that?
Very much so. I mean, he cast a very, very long shadow on our family's worldview. From, as I like to say, the front lines. All of us have been involved in social justice activism of all sorts. And my cousin, I have several different family members who went into the newspaper business, my cousin Mary Ellen being one who had a lifelong career there. And I think he's an inspiration. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. He was forgotten in a large part in the American history story, and thankfully is coming back. I mean, there were, Stephen Fox wrote a book about the Guardian and about Monroe Trotter, and more recently, Carrie Greenidge wrote a brilliant biography, Black Radical. So I think he's coming back, and of course, Professor Brooks's collaborative at Harvard is another bringing him back into the American story. But for our family, he was, we're all, half of us are named for him. He's a great inspiration.
I can imagine. And speaking of inspirations, Deborah, when we're talking about the Emancipator, you're preparing to launch the return of this publication after 200 years. What are some of the parallels that you either hope to emulate or perhaps build upon when we're talking about, of course, Trotter's publishing of the Boston Guardian?
Absolutely. Well, we actually launched on Monday, so we are out.
Oh, great.
Emancipator.org. Meet us in the social media streets also. But Trotter well knew that America had a tendency towards anti-Blackness. And his journalism and our journalism, our commentary for journalism, will dissect and decode the structural underpinnings of white supremacy that endangers us all. And we really are seeking true emancipation from misinformation, disinformation, from hate, from extremism. We have a lot to be emancipated from.
Absolutely. Dr. Austin, as we are encouraging a new generation into, advocating for their civil rights, where do you see the implementation of Trotter's work actively now? And of course, his history with pushing federal authorities.
I think this is so important. One of the things I challenge students to do is to think about what it means to be radical. What does radical mean? Radical, militant, for example. And I think about and share with them Trotter's strategies that were really multifaceted. I mean, of course, he is the editor of a media corporation, of malcontents, right? A readership that is malcontents. But what we know is that we need malcontents in order to imagine a new world. You can't actually imagine a new world without having some critiques of the world. And so the strategies of media, the strategies of direct action and mass protest, right? Using the spectacle to get more media coverage, but also petition drives, boycotts, conversations with, he had conversations with, so many governors over, decades. I mean, who is meeting with the governor? William Monroe Trotter is. So and he also, partners with the NAACP when two Black BU students are, not going to be able to be, are going to have to be in a segregated dorm. So there is coalition building, right? There are multiple strategies and actions that Trotter and his many organizations that he starts, the Suffrage League, the Citizens Committee, the National Equal Rights League. I mean, over the span of his life, he was at the head of not just The Guardian, but of several different grassroots organizations that had, that sort of toured, certainly in the Northeast, but nationally. And so I think the thing that I appreciate bringing forward from Trotter's life and from his work is the heterogeneity of the approaches and the diversity of practices and strategies that were inclusive of coalition building. So it's true that he absolutely took issue with Du Bois at some times, with Washington for sure. Although I'm sure that he also saw Washington as kind of like, the old head that you kind of needed to reckon with. I mean, Washington is sort of 20 years his senior at the point that Trotter is sort of, starting his activism. But but there is coalition building, and there are these moments where he is working with people that he was at odds with. And so I try to bring all of that forward to help students understand the dynamism of community organizing and what it could look like, because I think they often think, well, we can't work with people that we don't agree with, and actually we absolutely need to. Those are important coalitions that we have to build. We have to learn how to do that.
Absolutely. Reverend, I want you to talk about the tension that Trotter had with other Black leaders in the civil rights movement and how that maybe shaped the way that the movement moved, through present generations.
So, his relationship with other civil rights movement leaders and organizations was contentious and fractious. But here's a point I think bears noting. So in my previous life, I served as president and CEO of the NAACP. And everyone knows that Trotter, by creating the Niagara movement, laid the foundation for the NAACP. What is less known is that model became the model for the National Organization of Women and the National Resources Defense Council. So Trotter lays a foundation for major organizations with respect to civil rights and environmental justice and women's rights. And so while his relationship with civil rights leaders could be contentious, but he nevertheless provided a universal foundation for so many organizations. And so I think that's important. Number two, as Professor Austin lifted up, his strategies were multivalent, multidisciplinary, if you will. And so because at the Trotter Collaborative, named for him, we have worked with organizations across the country, from Black Voters Matter to the National Center on Race and the Environment, to mayors literally from Birmingham to Bristol, using a variety of his methods, from direct action to litigation to public and social media campaigns. The point being here is, yes, he had a contentious relationship with various leaders. He started multiple organizations. He probably could not be called an institution man. He was, very, very much an individualist. But he created a massive institutional legacy that endures to today.
Why do you think, and Lalou, I want to ask you this, why do you think that more people aren't aware of Trotter's work, of his legacy, his contributions? And what do you want folks, our audience, your audiences, as you work on, films in this vein, what do you want them to take away from his work and his legacy?
Well, I think to answer your first question, the reason I think he is not as well known was partly because he was a radical, that he was so, he was controversial, he was uncompromising. A lot of the things he worked for in his lifetime didn't come to fruition until later. Witness, one of his lifelong quests was a federal anti-lynching law. On his 150th anniversary of his birth was the year we finally got that. So I think some of that, with radicals, often they're not recognized until past their lifetimes because progress is slow and radicals are not on the slow train. And then I think he did make enemy of friend and foe. And I don't mean enemy. When he died, he had a massive funeral and he was respected, even if it was grudgingly in his lifetime, by his peers. Du Bois being one of the main ones. Du Bois didn't comment publicly on Trotter getting kicked out of the White House when he confronted Woodrow Wilson, but he did, behind the scenes. So there was respect for him, but he was so thorny, I think, that in some ways time let go of him. And then he didn't have children of his own. So while his remaining family members worked to keep his papers and all of that, make them safe and make sure that was relegated to a place in history. He didn't have family members, children of his own, who I think may have been a louder voice in passing along his legacy. What I want mostly is just for people to understand that Black history is American history. I think I'm focusing at this time the documentary on the confrontation with Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson went on to be a lauded man, and Trotter was forgotten. And the civil servants who worked in the federal government, who then faced a segregated federal government, he wiped out generations of Black wealth by decimating the Black middle class in Washington, D.C. So this is an important American story. And if history is something that we learn from, then, Trotter's legacy, I think, is one that we must learn from.
And Deborah, we just have a couple of minutes left, but you're continuing this work in the Emancipator. What do you hope readers take away from what you produced there?
Absolutely. Basically, we're using Black liberation as a point of entry to find foundational ideas about freedom and democracy. We're exploring through commentary, deeply evidence-based, scholarly, driven, community-focused commentary, solutions to solving issues tied to systemic racism and culture and norms. We're using a solutions journalism approach. It's a very specific practice that engages something called asset framing, which is dividing people by their aspirations, who they purpose themselves to be when they get up every day, as opposed to deficit framing, defining people or institutions or communities by the one bad thing that has happened to them. And that's a story that can be told so many times and becomes the only story or the single story of people. And so we want to tell a fuller, richer story and explore intersections of race and other identities and pull everybody into a dialogue and action based on the context that we provide. So we can actually achieve our true north, which is real democracy and inclusion, which is what Trotter always wanted.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say that is the end of our broadcast, but certainly not the conversation. It's the end of our show, too. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, stay with us as we continue this conversation on our digital platforms on Facebook and YouTube. Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. We are on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our conversation on William Monroe Trotter. Welcome back, everyone. For folks who may not recognize the folks on our screens, I want to introduce them to you. Reverend Cornell Williams Brooks. He is the director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the School Center for Public Leadership. And Lalou Trotter Dammond, she's a descendant of William Monroe Trotter and director, Craftwork Production. And also with us is Paula Austin, Dr. Paula Austin. She's assistant professor of history and African American studies at Boston University. And of course, Deborah Douglas is with us, co-editor-in-chief of the Emancipator at Boston University. Welcome back, everybody. So we're continuing this conversation on Trotter's legacy, and I also want to get back into this 150th celebration that the collaborative had. And Reverend Brooks, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, and also in the context of a major announcement from Harvard University recently.
As you noted, I'm the director of the Trotter Collaborative and a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I'm a member of the Harvard faculty and a member of that family or community. So most recently, a few days ago, Harvard released a report analyzing, assessing its relationship to slavery. 70 people enslaved by Harvard professors, staff, students, donors, examining its relationship, direct and indirect, with slavery in the South and in the Caribbean, assessing, analyzing the proceeds, the funding, the profit from the commodification and brutalization of Black bodies. And so this was rendered in a report by Dean Tamika Brown-Nagin. Extraordinary report, and at the end, there are a series of recommendations. One thing I would just note here is at the beginning of the, as I say, in the report, it chronicles this ugly history of predation, if you will, financial predation of Black people. But as it relates to Trotter, there's also a note of Black resilience, on Black resistance and Black resilience on campus. And a number of names are mentioned, not the least of which, prominent among which, is William Monroe Trotter. And I think that's important. Now, that by no means homogenizes or whitewashes that history, but it does make clear and something that Deborah Douglas lifted up, this notion that we have assets, that we have people, that we have resistance and resilience, and this was not a matter of acquiescence. So the report is powerful in terms of the analysis. I think the question for all of us is, how do we write the conclusion? What does Harvard do? How does Harvard repair? How does it engage in reparatory justice? And, having led the NAACP, working with students at the Trotter Collaborative on reparations in a couple of states and in the midst of a major paper on reparations now, I would say the conclusion has to be written by, yes, a committee, but it also needs to be written by people in the community, students, who call for a repair as large as the harm. And the harm is massive.
Dr. Austin, when you engage students in these conversations, what do you hear from them in terms of carrying on this work, especially through the lens of Trotter's legacy?
Students are so hungry for the history. I'm thinking about our conversation earlier about why don't we know more about William Monroe Trotter? I mean, I blame my discipline in particular. I think we have not been very good about telling the hard history, the hard U.S. history that is nuanced, that is complex, that is hard to talk about. And so I think students are really, when they learn about folks like William Monroe Trotter and other folks that we don't often talk about, and we haven't historically, they are, always shocked, but they're always really impressed by the sort of salience of the work that people were doing in our past and its relationship to our present movements and our present, kind of slate of inequities and injustices. And they're always eager to hear about strategies and techniques, but also the drama that is happening in those activist communities, because I think it helps them really think about the contemporary drama in a very different way. It helps them see that as a necessary part of building a movement, of a successful movement. I mean, I'm thinking about what you talked about, Lalou, earlier about, did he have any wins in terms of the things that he was working for? And the truth is that most movements don't have a lot of wins. And I think because my discipline, history, has decided to kind of, write the stories about the wins and call those successful. And what we don't have are all of the losses, right? The both personal ones, professional ones, the sort of movement ones that really had to happen, laying the groundwork for the wins that then happen later. Angela Davis talks about this as a marathon, not a sprint. So, William Monroe Trotter is one of those folks kind of building what we need for the marathon. And there's so many lessons from his life and from his activism that I think students are always hungry for and take away.
And Lalou, I was just going to ask, you're putting together this documentary. You have so many family stories. As you had mentioned in our earlier conversation, he cast a long shadow over the history of your family. How do we bring Trotter's legacy and his stories to new audiences through work like yours and other folks?
Yeah, I think, this is a ripe time, right? I think we have, as Reverend Brooks was saying in the earlier part of our discussion, we are in an unprecedented time of civil rights activism. Not unprecedented, but, a new wave, let's say. And I think that's a time when stories are naturally brought to the fore. And I think we're seeing that. Obviously, Professor Carrie Greenidge was working on her book before the murder of George Floyd, but it did come out subsequent to that, I think, unless it was the same year. I can't remember exactly, but still in the moment. So I think we're in a moment where people are hungry, as Dr. Austin was saying, hungry for stories about what the journey of the long fight for civil rights in this country.
Yeah. Deborah, I want to ask you, you mentioned that Emancipator launched this week. It's out. And as we embrace this new publication, which really in its tradition isn't new, how do we move forward in Trotter's work and bringing these stories to the fore?
Well, the Emancipator platform invites people into a deeper, more contextual conversation about the issues of the day, the issues that affect us all. And what we hope to do is to give people the tools and a way of analyzing the issues and policies and laws that impact us to make better decisions. We're deeply invested in solutions. We don't want to problematize everything. We don't want to problematize the Black experience or the experience of other marginalized people, but we want to move into a solutions frame. The fact of the matter, and this is where we get our inspiration from Trotter, is that we can be agents of our own salvation. And by having a platform where we can focus on these issues all day, every day on purpose, that's what we aim to do.
And Reverend Brooks, as we are in this new, I'll call it a season of the civil rights movement, a new season of the civil rights movement, do we see these changes lasting? And I'm speaking specifically of the new type of young folks that are advocating for the civil rights. Some of the federal and state move toward more equity, more parity on those levels in our institutions of government. Do we see that change to be lasting?
So I hear your question in two respects, right? So is the change lasting in terms of the means, the struggle, the resistance, the resilience? And is the change lasting in terms of the victories that we win, the legislation that we pass? And I think that the change is enduring, right? In the sense that the people don't give up. So meaning there's a through line, a thread of continuity from Trotter literally to the 18 and 19-year-olds in the street today. There have been ebbs and flows, ups and downs, but that tradition of activism has been unrelenting, right? And so that's encouraging to me in two respects. It's encouraging in terms of its continuity. It's also encouraging when, and I think Professor Austin will agree with me, the deep curiosity that students have with respect to the past, with respect to history. So it may be news to them, but it's good news. They love it, right? So, you know, I'm an activist, I've done that kind of thing, but I notice in my classrooms, and I teach undergraduates as well as graduate students, that they hang on to this stuff. They love, and the professor talked about the drama. They love the drama. They love the historical tea being spilled, right? They love this stuff because what it says to them is that our forebears, right, had their struggles. Our forebears didn't always have it right. They were missteps. They had missteps. They were accused of going too far. Trotter took a lot of criticism for not exercising the proper decorum in the White House and not deferring to the President of the United States. The kind of criticism he faced is the same criticism I saw that young people face when I went to Ferguson and Flint and every city I've ever been to, young people face that same kind of criticism. So my point being is, there's continuity, there's a historicity, there's a deep appreciation of the past, and so the change is enduring. It doesn't mean we win every day, but it does mean we show up every day.
I love that. I love that characterization. And my final question here is to Dr. Austin. How do we encourage this leadership and activism?
Well, I think one way is to know that we have a long tradition of it, and that the goal has been, and I think no matter what activists we look at in history, what Black activists we look at, whether they are, sort of someone we think about as conservative, like Booker T. Washington, or someone that we think about as radical, like William Monroe Trotter, is that the platforms that they were working on, the justice issues that they were working on, were multifaceted, right? It was always a multi-issue platform. All of those inequities, all of those injustices are part of a larger sort of state-sanctioned white supremacist structure. And all of the activists understood the relationships between those things and the necessity of fighting for all of them, right? There's a suffrage piece, there's a economic justice piece, there's a housing piece, there's a food insecurity piece. And so many of the activists we look at historically really got that and were indicting a larger structural system. And so I think contemporary activists are really embracing that in a way that I don't know that we've seen in a little while, or maybe that history hasn't told us was true of our historic kind of the traditional civil rights movement. So I think that the multi-issue platforms that contemporary activists are working on are very much related to the ways in which activists really since, Reconstruction and forward have been very vocal about.
Absolutely. Well, again, the conversation continues, but we will leave it there for now. I'd like to thank you all for being with us, and we will see everyone else next week.